During a routine flight from London to Toronto, a flight attendant notices something no one else does. An 8-year-old girl, fear in her eyes, trying desperately to ask for help, but the man sitting next to her isn't who he seems to be. What Clara discovers next changes the course of the flight and puts everyone's safety at risk. Find out how a Clara Evans walked briskly through the bustling halls of Gatwick Airport, her navy blue uniform perfectly pressed, and her golden name tag glinting under the bright overhead lights. Years of experience as a flight attendant had taught her to remain calm in any situation. But today, something was different. The sense of unease that had crept into her mind during her pre-flight preparations lingered like an unsettling shadow, making her heartbeat just a little faster than usual. It was a typical London morning. Gray skies loomed overhead and passengers hurried through the terminal, their faces reflecting a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. Clara had been on countless flights like this one, a transatlantic journey from London to Toronto. But as she approached the boarding gate for Fly Air Flight 417, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She paused for a moment, taking in her surroundings, the sounds of chatter, the beeps of boarding announcements, and the faint hum of engines preparing for takeoff. As passengers began boarding, Clara instinctively scanned each face that passed her. Most were the usual mix: businessmen glued to their phones, families wrangling restless children, and tourists with wide eyes and overstuffed bags. But then her eyes locked on a little girl, no more than 8 years old, clutching a small stuffed bunny tightly in one hand. The girl, with her large, expressive brown eyes, appeared anxious, glancing up nervously at the man walking beside her. Clara's practiced eye immediately noticed the contrast between the two. The girl's father, or at least the man she assumed to be her father, was distant. He was dressed neatly, but his attention was completely absorbed by the phone in his hand, barely acknowledging the child clinging to him. The little girl seemed almost invisible to him. As they neared the entrance of the plane, the girl's gaze met Clara's, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. Was it fear? Clara greeted them with her usual warm smile. "Welcome aboard," she said cheerfully, her eyes lingering on the girl a second longer than usual. But the man gave a curt nod, barely looking up from his phone, and ushered the girl past her without a word. Clara's smile faltered slightly as she watched them walk down the aisle, the girl casting a final fleeting glance back at her. As she resumed welcoming other passengers, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Something about the little girl's behavior nagged at her. She had seen it before, that quiet, desperate look in a child's eyes, the kind that screamed for help without making a sound. But there was no clear indication of danger, no obvious sign that anything was amiss, just a feeling. The cabin filled quickly, and soon the plane was preparing for takeoff. Clara moved through her usual pre-flight checks with precision, exchanging pleasantries with passengers, ensuring seatbelts were fastened, and demonstrating safety protocols. But all the while, her mind kept drifting back to the little girl in seat 17B. Clara made a mental note to keep an eye on her during the flight. As the plane taxied down the runway, Clara found herself glancing down the aisle toward where the girl sat, her small frame barely visible between the seats. She was leaning against the window, staring out at the tarmac, her stuffed bunny held tightly against her chest. The man beside her, Thomas, as Clara later learned from the passenger manifest, remained engrossed in his phone, completely detached from his daughter's quiet distress. Once the plane had reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign was switched off, Clara began her rounds through the cabin. She noticed that, despite the usual excitement of passengers getting up to stretch or grab something from their bags, the girl in 17B remained eerily still. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the stuffed animal, her knuckles white from the tight grip. Clara's instincts were screaming at her now. She knelt down beside the girl as she passed her row, pretending to adjust a nearby tray table. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl flinched slightly, her eyes darting to her father, but he was still absorbed in his phone, oblivious to the exchange. For a moment, the girl said nothing. Then, in the smallest, quietest voice, she whispered, "Help me." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She leaned in closer, careful not to draw attention. "What's wrong?" she asked gently, her mind racing. This wasn't the first time she had encountered a distressed child on a flight, but something about this girl's quiet desperation sent a chill down her spine. Before the girl could answer, Thomas shifted in his seat, glancing toward them. Clara straightened up quickly, flashing him a professional smile. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked smoothly, masking her concern. He looked at her for the first time, his eyes cold and calculating. "No, we're fine," he said in a clipped tone, before turning back to his phone. Clara nodded and moved on, her heart pounding in her chest. As she walked back to the galley, her mind was racing. What was going on with that little girl? And what could she do to help? Back in the galley, Clara pulled aside her colleague, Amelia Turner, and quickly explained what had happened. Amelia, ever the calm and collected professional, listened carefully, her expression growing more serious as Clara recounted the girl's whispered plea for help. "We need to do something," Clara said, her voice low but urgent. "I don't know what's going on, but that little girl is scared. I can feel it." Amelia nodded thoughtfully. "We'll have to be careful. We don't want to escalate the situation if we don't know the full story, but we can't ignore it either." The two flight attendants devised a plan. Clara would keep a close eye on the girl throughout the flight, while Amelia discreetly alerted the captain. If the situation seemed to worsen, they would notify authorities in Toronto to be ready upon landing. As Clara returned to the cabin, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had been trained to handle all sorts of emergencies, turbulence, medical issues, even unruly passengers. But this was different. This was a child, and every instinct in Clara's body told her that Sophie Miller was in danger. The hours of the flight dragged on slowly, and the tension inside the cabin weighed heavily on Clara's shoulders. She moved among the passengers, offering smiles, snacks, and drinks. But her mind kept circling back to Sophie in seat 17B. Every so often she would glance over, watching the little girl who sat perfectly still, clutching her stuffed bunny like it was her only shield. Thomas, the man next to Sophie, still showed no interest in the girl. His eyes were glued to his phone, occasionally sipping from a cup of water or adjusting his headphones. Clara tried to calm her growing anxiety, reminding herself not to let her concern turn into panic. She knew that without any concrete evidence, she couldn't act rashly. Accusing someone mid-flight without solid proof could create a dangerous situation for everyone on board. Finally, after making another round through the cabin, Clara discreetly approached Amelia at the back of the plane. They had exchanged quick words earlier, and now Amelia's expression looked more serious than before. "The captain's been informed," Amelia whispered, her voice low but firm. "He's going to notify security in Toronto as soon as we get closer. But Clara, we have to be cautious. Any wrong move could make things worse." Clara nodded, though the advice didn't sit well with her. She knew Amelia was right. But the thought of standing by while that child might be in danger made Clara feel helpless. Glancing back down the aisle, Clara spotted Sophie, now resting her head against the window, gripping her bunny tighter than ever. It gave Clara a momentary sense of relief, but Thomas's continued aloofness disturbed her deeply. Suddenly, a slight turbulence rocked the plane, and Clara felt her stomach drop. The cabin shuddered gently, and passengers glanced around, mildly unsettled but not alarmed. She listened to the captain's instructions for everyone to remain seated. But in her heart, she knew the turbulence outside was nothing compared to the emotional storm brewing inside her. Once the plane steadied, Clara resolved to try another approach. Maybe she could get more information from Sophie without alerting Thomas. She poured a small cup of juice and headed towards row 17, leaning down gently. "Sophie, honey, are you doing okay? Would you like some juice or water?" Clara asked softly, her voice calm and kind. Thomas looked up briefly, his gaze cold and dismissive as it landed on Clara. But then, to her surprise, he spoke. "She doesn't need anything," he said curtly, his tone sharp and final. Sophie didn't move, but her eyes slowly opened, revealing once again that anxious, pleading look that Clara couldn't ignore. Before Clara could say anything more, Sophie whispered something so faint that Clara barely heard it over the hum of the engines. "He's not my dad." Clara's heart stopped. She took a small step back, her mind reeling. Not her dad. The words echoed in her head like an alarm. What did that mean? Who was this man then? And more importantly, what was happening to Sophie? Maintaining her composure, Clara excused herself and returned to the galley, where she immediately told Amelia what had just happened. Amelia's expression hardened, her concern now turning into alarm. "This confirms it," Amelia said, pulling the curtain of the galley closed to avoid the other passengers overhearing. "We need to protect that little girl until we land. I'm going to speak to the captain about notifying the authorities even sooner." While Amelia talked with the captain, Clara tried to calm her nerves. Sophie was in danger, and there was no longer any doubt about it. From this point on, every move they made had to be calculated to ensure Sophie's safety without tipping Thomas off. The only thing that gave Clara hope was knowing that they would be landing in Toronto soon, and the authorities would be ready to intervene. But until then, they had to keep the situation under control, and any misstep could have serious consequences. Clara wasn't about to let that happen. She returned to the cabin, masking her anxiety with a professional smile. As the flight continued, she kept a close eye on Thomas. He seemed more agitated now, as if he was beginning to realize that Clara was paying too much attention to Sophie. Occasionally, he glanced around the cabin, his eyes scanning the flight attendant's movements. This only confirmed Clara's suspicions. Thomas was hiding something. Finally, the captain made an announcement that the plane would begin its descent towards Toronto in a few hours. Time was running out, and Clara knew they had to ensure Sophie's protection as soon as they touched the ground. If you're eager to see what happens to Sophie and how Clara will navigate this tense situation on board, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next part of this gripping story. There are more twists and surprises to come. As the plane cruised over the Atlantic, the tension between Clara and Thomas seemed to thicken like the clouds outside. Clara's mind raced through possible scenarios, trying to anticipate what Thomas might do if he realized that she and the crew were onto him. Every time she passed row 17, she felt his eyes on her, cold and calculating. She had to remain discreet, but time was running out. Amelia returned from speaking with the captain, her face serious. "We're set. The authorities will meet us at the gate in Toronto," she said quietly, keeping her voice low. "But we have to be careful. Any sudden moves could trigger him." Clara nodded. "We can't let anything happen to Sophie before we land, but he's getting suspicious. I can feel it. He's watching me." Amelia glanced down the aisle toward Thomas, who was still focused on his phone, though his body language seemed more rigid than before. "Let's stick to the plan. We'll make sure they're the last to deplane. That will give the authorities time to position themselves," Clara agreed, though the thought of waiting any longer made her stomach churn. She wanted nothing more than to whisk Sophie away from the man who wasn't her father. The weight of her responsibility pressed down hard on her. Every moment felt like a countdown. As Clara continued her rounds, the flight attendants began preparing the passengers for landing, following protocol as usual. But Clara's mind was elsewhere, focused solely on protecting Sophie. She knew that any rash action could escalate the situation, and there was no telling what Thomas was capable of if he felt cornered. As Clara checked seatbelts and tray tables, she noticed Sophie's small hands trembling as she held on to her stuffed bunny. The girl looked pale, her wide eyes glancing nervously at Thomas. He hadn't said much since Clara's last interaction, but his silence was unsettling. Clara knew they had to act fast. Once the final checks were complete, Clara and Amelia exchanged a glance that said everything. They were ready. Clara would be the one to ensure that Sophie and Thomas stayed in their seats until the authorities arrived. It was a delicate operation, and every second counted. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin grew. The fastened seatbelt signs illuminated, and passengers started preparing for landing. Clara's heart raced as she made her final sweep down the aisle. She paused at row 17, her eyes lingering on Sophie. The girl looked up at her, her eyes filled with silent fear. Clara smiled softly, trying to offer some comfort. She reached out and gently touched Sophie's hand, hoping to communicate that everything was going to be okay. But the little girl didn't smile back. She was too scared, too confused. Thomas shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he watched the brief interaction. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Clara straightened up, forcing a smile. "No, sir, just making sure everyone's ready for landing." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Then he nodded slowly and turned back to his phone, but not before Clara caught the flicker of something darker in his gaze. He knew something was off. He was starting to figure it out. Clara hurried back to the galley, her pulse quickening. "He's getting suspicious," she whispered to Amelia. "We need to be ready for anything." Amelia glanced at the clock. "We're almost there. Just keep calm. The authorities are already waiting for us." The plane touched down with a slight bump, and as the passengers began to gather their belongings, Clara and Amelia moved into action. They had to delay Thomas and Sophie from deplaning with the rest of the passengers without raising too much suspicion. Clara approached row 17 as passengers started to exit the plane. "Sir, I'll need you to stay seated for a moment," she said calmly, her tone professional. "There's a minor issue with your connecting flight information that we need to verify." Thomas frowned, his eyes narrowing again. "What issue?" "We don't have a connecting flight." Clara kept her expression neutral. "It's just a routine check. It won't take long." Thomas hesitated, glancing toward the door as passengers filed out. Clara could see the gears turning in his mind, trying to figure out if she was lying. She held her breath, praying that he would stay seated just long enough for the authorities to arrive. To her relief, he sat back down, though his suspicion was now palpable. Sophie, still clutching her bunny, didn't move. Her wide eyes remained locked on Clara, silently pleading for help. Clara gave her a reassuring nod, hoping that the girl understood she wasn't alone. The last of the passengers had disembarked, leaving the cabin eerily quiet. Outside, Clara could see the ground crew moving around, unloading luggage, but her focus was on the door to the jet bridge. Any second now, the authorities would be there. Thomas shifted again, glancing at his watch. "What's taking so long?" he demanded, his tone sharper now. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the door to the cabin opened, and two uniformed police officers stepped inside. Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she kept her expression composed. "Sir," one of the officers said as they approached row 17, "we need to ask you to come with us." Thomas's face hardened, his body tensing as he realized what was happening. "What is this?" he demanded, standing up abruptly. The officers moved quickly, positioning themselves between him and Sophie. "Please remain calm," one of them said, his voice firm. "We need to ask you some questions." For a moment, it seemed as though Thomas might try to resist. His eyes darted between the officers and Clara, who stood a few feet away, her heart pounding in her chest. But then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Thomas raised his hands in mock surrender. "I didn't do anything," he muttered as the officers moved to escort him out of the plane. Sophie remained in her seat, frozen with fear. Clara quickly moved to her side, kneeling down in front of her. "It's okay now, Sophie," she whispered, her voice gentle. "You're safe." The little girl stared at her for a moment, her lips trembling, before she finally broke down into tears. Clara wrapped her arms around Sophie, holding her tightly as the officers led Thomas off the plane. The nightmare was over. As Thomas was led off the plane, the tension in the cabin finally began to ease. The police officers escorted him through the jet bridge, their firm grip on his arms leaving no room for resistance. Clara stayed behind, holding Sophie, who was trembling in her arms. The child's sobs were soft but filled with a kind of fear that broke Clara's heart. Amelia approached quietly, kneeling beside them. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered to Sophie, her voice soothing and gentle. "You're safe now." Sophie lifted her head from Clara's shoulder, her tear-filled eyes searching Amelia's face for reassurance. Slowly, the little girl nodded, though her grip on her stuffed bunny never loosened. Clara wiped away a tear from Sophie's cheek and offered her a small, comforting smile. The worst was over, but the emotional weight of what had just transpired would linger for much longer. The captain appeared at the front of the cabin, his expression grim but relieved. "Is everything under control?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the now empty plane. Clara nodded. "Yes, the authorities have taken him. Sophie is safe." The captain exhaled, his relief palpable. Good work, Clara. You handled this incredibly well. Clara offered a modest smile, though inside she still felt the lingering fear of what could have happened. She knew that acting on her instincts had made all the difference. If she hadn't listened to Sophie's silent plea for help, things could have turned out very differently. She shuddered at the thought. As the ground crew finished clearing the last of the passengers' luggage, a police officer re-entered the plane. He approached Clara and Amelia, offering a calm but serious look. "We've taken the suspect into custody," he informed them. "He'll be questioned about his connection to the child and her whereabouts prior to the flight." Clara felt a knot of anxiety in her chest. "What will happen to Sophie now?" she asked, her voice betraying the worry she'd carried for the little girl throughout the flight. The officer knelt down to Sophie's level, speaking gently. "Sophie, we're going to take you to a safe place, okay? Your mom is on her way. You'll see her soon." At the mention of her mother, Sophie's eyes lit up, a small glimmer of hope shining through the fear. Clara's heart swelled with emotion. The little girl had endured so much in silence, and now finally there was a light at the end of the tunnel. Her mother was coming. As Sophie was escorted off the plane, Clara followed closely behind, unable to tear herself away from the girl she had worked so hard to protect. The cool Toronto air hit her face as they stepped onto the jet bridge. But Clara barely noticed. Her mind was racing, thinking about the ordeal Sophie had been through, and what still lay ahead for her. In the terminal, a crowd of passengers who had already deplaned were gathered near the baggage claim, unaware of the drama that had unfolded on board. Clara stayed close to Sophie as the police led her to a quiet area near one of the airport's offices, where they could wait for her mother to arrive. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Clara kept a comforting hand on Sophie's shoulder, offering her quiet reassurances. Amelia stood nearby, ready to assist if needed, though she knew this was a moment that belonged to Clara and Sophie. And then, from across the terminal, a woman appeared, running towards them with desperation in her eyes. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, but there was no mistaking the recognition in Sophie's eyes. It was her mother. "Sophie," the woman cried, her voice cracking with emotion. She dropped her bags and rushed to her daughter, scooping her into a tight embrace. Sophie clung to her mother, sobbing into her chest as the two collapsed to the floor, wrapped in each other's arms. Clara stepped back, giving them space, but feeling the overwhelming surge of relief wash over her. She watched as Sophie's mother, Helen, kissed the top of her daughter's head, whispering words of comfort between her tears. The reunion was raw and powerful, a testament to the strength of a mother's love and the resilience of a child who had fought silently for her own safety. The police officers stood at a respectful distance, allowing the emotional moment to unfold. Clara felt her own tears threatening to surface, but she blinked them away. This was why she did what she did. Moments like this, where she could make a difference, save a life, reunite a family, made all the challenges of her job worth it. Helen looked up, her eyes meeting Clara's. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with gratitude. "Thank you for saving my daughter." Clara smiled, her throat tightening with emotion. "I'm just glad she's safe," she replied, her voice soft. The mother and daughter stayed huddled together, refusing to let go of each other, as if the world outside didn't matter anymore. Clara knew that Sophie would carry the weight of this experience for some time, but at least she was now in the arms of the person who loved her most. As the scene quieted down, the police began speaking with Helen, explaining what would happen next. Clara and Amelia stood by, their roles in the situation slowly coming to an end. Clara felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, exhaustion, and a deep sense of fulfillment. She had trusted her instincts, and it had led to saving Sophie's life. Clara and Amelia eventually stepped away, leaving the family to their private reunion. As they walked back towards the crew area, Clara felt a hand on her arm. She turned to see Amelia, giving her a proud smile. "You did a good thing today," Amelia said. "You saved her." Clara nodded, the weight of the day finally settling over her. "We saved her," she corrected, though a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. As they exited the terminal, the night sky above Toronto was dotted with stars, clear and calm. Clara took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs, It had been an intense and emotional day, but she had no regrets. She knew she would carry this memory with her forever. As the evening deepened in Toronto, the passengers from Fly Air Flight 417 had long since scattered, blending into the city's night. But for Clara, the events of the day still played out vividly in her mind. She had left the airport, but the weight of Sophie's fear and the desperate moments on board the plane clung to her like a shadow. She sat in a quiet corner of the airport lounge, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, though she barely tasted it. The adrenaline that had carried her through the flight was wearing off, leaving behind an ache in her chest. She felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion, but mostly a deep sense of responsibility. Today, she had been more than just a flight attendant. Today, she had been Sophie's protector. Across the lounge, Amelia joined her, her expression thoughtful. "Long day," she said, sliding into the seat opposite Clara. Clara nodded, staring out the large window that overlooked the tarmac. The planes moved slowly in the distance, their lights flickering like tiny stars. "It's not every day you have to rescue a child," Clara replied softly. Amelia leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "You did everything right, Clara. You trusted your gut, and because of that, Sophie is safe with her mother, right now." Clara sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know. It's hard to let it go. What if I hadn't noticed her? What if I'd been too busy with the other passengers? She might still be trapped." Amelia reached out, placing a comforting hand on Clara's arm. "But you did notice. That's the important part. You saved her life today." Clara knew Amelia was right, but the what-ifs still echoed in her mind. She had learned long ago that her job was more than serving drinks and ensuring passengers' comfort. Sometimes it was about noticing the smallest details, the slight tremor in a child's hand, the subtle fear in their eyes, and today, that instinct had made all the difference. As they sat in silence, the soft chime of a phone interrupted their thoughts. Clara glanced down at her own. But it wasn't ringing. It was Amelia's phone, lighting up with a message. Amelia smiled and handed it to Clara. "It's from Sophie's mother," Amelia said. Clara took the phone, her eyes scanning the message. "I don't have the words to thank you both. Sophie is resting now, but she hasn't let go of me since we left the airport. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there, but I'll forever be grateful. You saved my little girl." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes as she read the message. The emotional weight of the day finally broke through, and she let out a shaky breath. She had done it. She had truly made a difference. "She's okay," Clara whispered, more to herself than to Amelia. Amelia smiled, her expression softening. "She's more than okay. She's safe, and that's because of you." Clara handed the phone back to Amelia and wiped her eyes. The heaviness in her chest was beginning to lift, replaced by a warmth she hadn't realized she needed. The satisfaction of knowing Sophie was safe, of knowing she had played a part in reuniting a mother and her child, made every moment of fear and doubt worth it. The lounge grew quieter as the night wore on. Eventually, Clara and Amelia stood up, ready to head back to their hotel for some much-needed rest. But as they gathered their things, Clara paused, looking back out at the runway, one last time. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I've always loved flying, the freedom of it, the sense of adventure. But today, it felt like more than just a job. Today I was reminded of why we do what we do. It's not just about getting people from one place to another, it's about keeping them safe, no matter what." Amelia nodded, her expression reflective. "We're the guardians up there, Clara, and you. You were Sophie's guardian today." Clara smiled at that, the title sitting comfortably with her. She had been a guardian today, and she would carry that sense of purpose with her into every flight from now on. As they exited the lounge and made their way through the quiet corridors of the airport, Clara felt a sense of closure beginning to settle in. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, vast and full of stars, and though the day had been long and emotionally exhausting, she knew she had done exactly what she was meant to do. Just as they were about to step outside into the cool Toronto night, Clara's phone buzzed. She glanced down and saw a new message from an unknown number. Curiosity piqued. She opened it. "Hi, Clara. This is Helen. I just wanted to say thank you again. Sophie's sleeping now, but before she went to bed, she asked me to tell you something. She said, 'Tell Clara that she's my hero.' Clara stopped in her tracks, her heart swelling with emotion. She read the message over and over, her throat tightening with each word. Sophie's hero. Amelia turned to look at her. Everything okay? Clara nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek as she smiled. Yeah, everything's more than okay. With that, Clara and Amelia stepped out into the night, their hearts lighter than they had been in hours. The stars above seemed brighter now, as if the universe itself was acknowledging the quiet heroism that had unfolded thousands of feet above the earth. And as Clara looked up at those stars, she knew one thing for sure. No matter where her flights took her next, she would always carry Sophie's story with her. A reminder of the power of intuition, of bravery, and of the bond between a child and a protector. As the cool breeze wrapped around them, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had been Sophie's hero today, and tomorrow she would be ready to do it all over again. If you were moved by this powerful story and want to experience more heartfelt, inspiring, and emotional tales, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another video. We've got many more incredible stories like this one coming your way, so stay tuned.